This is episode 15 of Ethics and Culture Cast from the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. Welcome to episode 15 of Ethics and Culture Cast from the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm Ken Hellenius, the communications specialist at the center. In this episode, we sit down with D.C. Schindler, an associate professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family, and author of Freedom from Reality, the Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty, the newest volume in the center's book series, Catholic Ideas for a Secular World, with the University of Notre Dame Press. Let's head into the Marion Short Ethics Library for this week's conversation. I'm here today with Professor D.C. Schindler. He's an associate professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America. He received his Ph.D. from CUA in 2001 with a dissertation on the philosophy of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Prior to joining the faculty at the John Paul II Institute, he taught at Villanova University from 2001 to 2013 and spent a research year in Munich as part of an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship during 2007 to 2008. Professor Schindler is a translator of French and German and has served as an editor of Communio, the International Catholic Review, since 2002. His latest book, Freedom from Reality, the Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty, is the newest volume in the series Catholic Ideas for a Secular World, the Center for Ethics and Culture's book series with the University of Notre Dame Press. Professor Schindler, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Ken.
So tell us a bit about yourself. What brought you to Notre Dame?
Well, originally, my father was a professor here. So I began as a high school student at St. Joe's High School across the street, and the natural move was to University of Notre Dame. So I did a bachelor's degree in the great books, the program of liberal studies, graduated in 92, and went on for a master's degree in studies of marriage and family and theology at the John Paul II Institute, but discovered that my interests were a bit more philosophical than theological. So I switched to philosophy at Catholic U and did a master's and PhD there. So the program of liberal studies is an interdisciplinary program. And so rather than being specialized right from the outset, I always had very broad interests. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was torn between philosophy and theology. And I still am.
Well, and this book kind of is crossing that back and forth, as well as your other books, right? That's right.
I think if you do philosophy seriously, you can't but engage with the big theological questions, and that's especially true if you are thinking as a believer. Those questions are unavoidable, and if you try to avoid them, I think it actually will always send your thinking in a bad direction.
In a bad way.
So I think honest thinking is going to cross that boundary pretty naturally.
Sure. What are your intellectual interests?
So, yeah, I would say my main areas, as you mentioned, are metaphysics and anthropology. And the way I like to think about it is my interest is sort of clustered around particular things. So in metaphysics, I'm especially interested in the transcendentals, the classic transcendentals, truth, beauty, and goodness. What are these realities? And then in philosophical anthropology, I like to think about the anthropological correlates of those, so knowledge and freedom and love. And so most of the work that I do is in, I would say, more or less within those parameters. And it's ongoing. There's some of those areas that I've developed much more than others, but they're all I've got plans for all of it.
We'll get to that later because I'm really interested in where this goes. So, what do you teach at the John Paul II Institute?
So I was hired there a few years ago to help with the philosophy component. The program there is very interesting. When you hear the Institute for Studies in Marriage and Family, you might think that it's focused on sociology or maybe simply presenting the church's teaching on the moral issues concerned with marriage and family. And of course, those represent a part of what we do, but what the Institute does most fundamentally is think about the faith as a whole, and in fact, life as a whole, the reality simply through the lens of marriage and family. So it's not in the first place the object of study. It's a sort of a lens that opens into every object of study, and so it's a very interesting program. We've got extraordinary faculty there, and one of the things that we require of the students is a very serious philosophical formation as part of their study, and I was brought on for that. Even though all of the faculty do it in some respect, sure. I was tasked with the explicit philosophy classes. So I teach a metaphysics class called Being as Gift. And then I teach some classes in philosophical anthropology. There's some rotating courses. But then another standard one that I teach is one that I especially like on the philosophy of work, the meaning of work, called Dominion and Techne. So those are my principal areas. So
how did you get involved with the Center for Ethics and Culture?
I would say, as many people know, the circles around Notre Dame tend to, even those that have their beginnings in disparate places, they tend to fold into each other and intersect and overlap. And my wife, Jeannie Heffernan, was first a graduate student at Notre Dame, and then she also did some work, has always been deeply involved in the pro-life work at various levels. That's her family began the Right to Life movement with another family in Illinois. So that's always been a big commitment of hers. And I believe it's through that kind of work that she got to know Carter Sneed. Mm-hmm. And Carter and I were having some conversations through at some event or other, and I had mentioned my interest in the problem of freedom, and he invited me to come first and give a lecture at the fall conference, which was an extraordinary experience. That fall conference is. I described it as to my colleagues when I returned as kind of a Catholic academic Woodstock. It seems to bring everybody that is intellectual and Catholic in the country together. So the spirit of reunion, along with always very interesting topics of discussion. So that was my principal involvement, and then Carter invited me to submit the manuscript for the press, for their series in the Notre Dame Press.
Yeah. Well, this book, Freedom from Reality, has a wonderful title, wonderful cover, too. Obviously, we talked a bit about that this afternoon at the panel discussion, just kind of how beautiful it is. But also, your title is itself incredibly intriguing. You use this word, the diabolical character of modern liberty. Explain, kind of unpack what you mean when you say diabolical to describe this.
Sure. There was some hesitation putting that on the title initially because I thought it might give the wrong impression of what the book is about. But I found the idea so compelling that it really became kind of a governing idea of the book, and so it really belonged on the cover. The basic idea, it's the diabolical, the Greek root of the diabolical is diaballein, which has a perfect correlate, opposite, which is sunbalein, which is the root of the word symbol. So diabolical is the exact opposite of symbolical, symbol and symbolical. And the word symbol, we think of it as just usually a sign that refers to something, but the word has a much more interesting history, and I won't go into all the details here. But essentially, the word means a joining together, a unity, and what a symbol does is it invites us to a kind of indwelling of a meaning, a communion with meaning. In symbols, we're united in common meanings, and ultimately we're united with the source of meaning. So in the book, I set up kind of a couplet, the symbolical and the diabolical, and take the symbolical or the symbolic order as representing a classical vision, pre-modern vision of reality. This would be the classical tradition and the medieval view, where all of reality speaks of God, and we are all joined together in our coming to understand and interpret things, and that unity is a formative principle, a foundational principle for the way we organize society, the way in all sorts of very unconscious ways. It's not necessarily that we realize that we're doing this, but these meanings are built into the reality that we inhabit, and spontaneously these serve to join us together and to make our life good, true, beautiful, and fruitful, and genuinely human. So the diabolical is just the opposite of that. Instead of joining together, the word diabalein means to cast asunder, to set apart, to separate. And I thought of that as a useful image for what happens in the kind of fragmentation of reality in the rise of modernity, that you have instead of meanings that draw us together, we separate space out, private, protected space, protect ourselves from each other, and ultimately, I argue, protect ourselves from reality, protect ourselves from God. Even though this isn't always deliberate, there's a gesture of separation at the heart of this. So, the diabolical means, as I said, casting asunder, setting apart. But I also pick up the traditional connotative meanings of the word.
Sure.
The devil, the demonic. The devil is one who says no. The diabolical is a basic no to reality. The diabolical is as the father of lies, right? Essentially deceptive, and it seems to me that these modern and when I say modern, I don't mean just things that are around now. I mean modern in terms of the Enlightenment worldview. They substitute for a reality. They present, in a way, deceptive images of reality that substitute for it. Another note in the diabolical is the self-destructive, the self-annihilating, and it seems to me that this notion has gotten this form of separation and fragmentation, and such a radical fragmentation that we're turned against ourselves. This form has been embedded in the values and the institutions of modern culture, and I think we can free ourselves from them only if we first understand that that's what's going on. I think we've become enslaved to the modern conception of freedom, and we've gotten caught up in these distortions and this isolation from reality, from God, from others, and ultimately even from ourselves. The first step to getting beyond that is to recognize it,
Sure.
call it what it is, and try to understand it.
So it's built into the very structures, our political structures, our societal structures, such that most of us aren't even aware.
That's right. An example would be this, for example, notion of rights. We think of rights as powers, and we think of them as in a way a kind of a weapon that we use against others and against maybe some obligations that we have, so that we ought to have precisely because of our belonging to a community, say. So the notion of rights obviously in a way comes from a sense of human dignity, which is a precious thing that needs to be preserved. And so it taps into something that's good. An actual truth, an actual reality, but it reinterprets that in ways that are destructive. And so the very things that we promote and we ought to promote end up in very subtle but profound ways undermining those things themselves and other things. So it's a very tricky business. But some of what I say might sound sort of mystical and abstract, metaphysical. But I think we see these kinds of paradoxes all around us. That we're all familiar with rights being used as a weapon.
Yeah.
For instance,
my rights trump yours, or whatever it might be.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Right, and that's there's a kind of violence in that. There are many other things, but that would be an example.
So you've described this as a metaphysical reflection on the meaning of liberty,
mm-hmm.
and yet you're also talking about very much a political reality. So why a metaphysical reflection
on politics?
Yeah.
No, I'm glad that you asked that. There's a good bit that's being written now that are similar in spirit to this book. That historical circumstances have brought us to a point where we realize that the problems in our contemporary culture are not they're fundamental problems. They're not simply a leak that's sprung in an otherwise good structure that just simply needs to be patched up. I think we're beginning to realize that the things that ail us are fundamental. And as I said, there are a number of books that are being written about this and are addressing different aspects of it, historical aspects, the history of ideas, the political stakes, the ethical dimension, the religious question, and all of these are absolutely crucial and fundamental. But it seems to me that it's a little more rare that we actually think in terms of metaphysics. We think to the metaphysical dimension of these sorts of problems, and that's not. This book is not going to be a bestseller. It's metaphysical thinking is hard work and it's not so popularly accessible. But it seems to me, it's work that has to be done, and not to replace all of these other approaches, but to complement them. Because this metaphysical dimension needs to be attended to, so that's the modest hope of this book, is to try to make some contribution in that direction.
As author, who are you writing for?
Oh, that's a tough question. That's a very tough question. I wish that I could write more for a broad audience, but I've come to realize that's just not my gift. So, but it's a curious thing, because on the other hand, this book is not meant simply for academics. It's not meant to be a specialized scholarly work, and I think that's obvious already from the title. This isn't a typical title that you would find on a scholarly tome.
Right.
I, in that sense, I'm aiming more broadly. It's not just at the academy, but it's I suppose I'm trying to hit this intersection of philosophy and culture. Questions that are existentially interesting, so they're not just theoretical problems, but existential problems that concern the way we live. They concern everyday life, but to try to think about them at a deep level. And the philosophers that I admire write in this way. And when I say admire, it doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with them. Sure. But I would mention, like Heidegger, Hegel, Nietzsche, obviously have very profound disagreements with what they say, but I would take them as representative of this kind of attempt to grapple with existential, meaningful questions, but at a deep level. Yeah. So that's kind of the aspiration.
So now that you've added your voice to this conversation, and I agree with you, this is ground that's been well trod even in the last few years. I think, of course, of After Virtue, 1981, with Alistair McIntyre. I think of the Benedict option, Rod Dreher. I think of even Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. They're all kind of approaching some of these same questions, and yet, as you say, from different directions. Right. Is that it? Is society doomed? What do we do? Where do you go from here?
Where do we go from here?
And where do we go from here?
Yeah. Well, we go to church, and the discussion is in some ways can become very abstract, but the reality being discussed is very concrete. And it seems to me, one of the things I argue about in the book is this is about recovering reality. And the amazing thing about reality is it's right in front of our faces. This is not something lost in the mists of time. This is not something up in the heavens. I mean, reality is our relationships with our children and with our community, our the way we think about work, the way we organize our home, the way we plan cities and constitute communities. All these things are there's a metaphysical dimension built into all these things, and it seems to me what I am hoping and what the book aims to do is to recall our attention to the very concrete realities that are involved in these day-to-day experiences, and to try to live them more authentically. So, I mean, in a way, the problem is extremely great and deep and impossible for anybody to solve. But in another sense, precisely the profundity of the problem means that we solve it by just doing little things differently. Having one thing I would point to, for instance, is freeing ourselves from technology. That's something very concrete. To privilege direct human contact with a person when we can, as distinct from always technologically mediated relations. To bake our own bread, to plant a garden. I mean, these things seem sort of trite, but I know from my own experience and seeing people around me, the smallest things like this can be profoundly liberating, and you see that it already brings to mind a different frame of mind, a different way of thinking about things. And you mentioned these many books that are being written now. It seems to me that there's something in the air. I mean, we're all looking for the same thing. Ultimately, we can trust that we're all looking for the same thing. We all want an alternative to what
we've received and built for ourselves,
right? And which is showing its defects increasingly. So there's hope. There's definitely there's hope.
It strikes me that the answer you've just given is also the exact sort of answer that somebody who works at the John Paul II Institute for Studies in Marriage and Family, as with the family being the building block of society you should be giving.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. That's right. Right. It sounds too simple, but there really is something to be said about beginning with the family. There's so much that's involved in unconscious ways in just that most fundamental human relationship. That's a good place to begin.
Where do you go from here as an author? Because you've done a good job of kind of calling our attention to the metaphysical relationship or the truth there. Right. Yeah. What next
What's
for
next?
you?
I mean, in general, what I'm hoping to do is take some of these basic concepts like freedom and love and try to re-enrich them by drawing on the great tradition, because I think so many of these things have become impoverished. But very specifically, this book is itself it's meant to be volume 1 of a trilogy, actually, and I think that's important to say because it ends with Plato and Aristotle, but it's not the case that I think Plato and Aristotle are the solution to these problems. I present them in the book as the first foundation for rethinking this question of freedom, and I think that's true. That they represent a beginning that ought never to be left behind, that we need to carry with us. But that beginning has been developed, and so Volume 2 is meant to be. Which I'm neck deep in the research for that right now. Volume 2 is meant to be a look at the Christian appropriation of the classical tradition. I'm coming to the conclusion that freedom is the gift of Christianity to the world. It's going to take a long time to explain exactly what I mean by that, but that gift needs to be received properly, and some of the history of the reception has gone awry, and I think in many ways the modern liberal conception of freedom can be traced to a certain distortion of the Christian reception of the classical tradition. But that will have to be laid out. And then the third volume will be finally a constructive metaphysics, an attempt to just think through, okay, now that we've looked at history and we've thought about the contemporary problems, what exactly should we think about freedom? What is freedom? That'll be the third volume, I hope. These things always evolve a bit over time, and it'll be certainly some years before I get to that one, but that's how I see it now.
Well, we look forward to reading those when you get less neck deep in Volume 2 and then Volume 3. So,
very good.
David, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ken. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you to Professor David Schindler. Check the show notes for the YouTube link to our Authors Roundtable discussion about his book with Michael Moreland of Villanova University, Adam Seagrave from the University of Missouri, and Peter Simpson of CUNY. You can learn more about the Center for Ethics and Culture by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu. Subscribe to Ethics and Culture Cast, which is released every other Thursday during the academic year, by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu/podcast. We would love your feedback. Please give us a review on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And email your suggestions to cecpodcast@nd.edu. Our theme music is I Dunno by Grapes, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution License. We'll see you next time on Ethics and Culture Cast. Until then, make good decisions.